Okay, I think we can start. Oh, great. Welcome everybody to our panel on the future of trade, a very hot topic this year at Davos. I'll just give you a quick introduction. Many of you obviously are very familiar with the topic, but I'll do a quick overview. And then we'll start with a poll that both you in the audience and people who are listening or watching the live stream can answer, and that'll help tee off the conversation. So you know this has been a very challenging year for trade. The US-China trade war has created tensions and fostered enormous confusion around the world as both taunts and tariffs have flown back and forth across the world's two largest economies. The future of trade relations between the UK and Europe remain in dangerous limbo as the UK proceeds with Brexit, and EU-US trade relations are none too friendly either. The World Trade Organization has been left without one of its chief assets, its appellate body, as the US has effectively demolished it by blocking the filling of all vacancies. Protectionism and nationalism still hold sway in many, many places, with tariffs disrupting supply chains worldwide. Some progress has arguably been made recently, mostly bilaterally and regionally as opposed to globally. A limited tariff lowering deal between the US and Japan has just been completed. The USMCA, or TMEC as we're going to call it today because we have the Mexico economy minister here, is about to replace NAFTA with a treaty that seems to see Canada, Mexico, and the US after some very tough negotiations. And of course, the Phase 1 trade deal between the US and China, while perhaps just a pause in an ongoing war, provides at least some hope of greater normalcy and predictability. So we're here today to look ahead, to discuss what is and what should be next for global trade relations. Is the ideal of free, or maybe I'll say free-ish trade, dead or dying? Are trade rules enforceable anymore? Or does might make right when it comes to trade? Is the WTO in an existential crisis? And we have the right person to ask about that. Or is it reformable and revivable? And what is the path towards a more productive trade environment? So let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll get going. Closest to me is Dr. Graciela Marquez, Mexico's Minister of Economy. Then Keiyu Jin, oh, I'm sorry, not Keiyu Jin, Robert Azevedo, Director General of the WTO. Then Keiyu Jin, who's economics professor and a China expert at the London School of Economics. And then Chad Bown, who is senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and has by far the best tie on the panel. That's somebody who really cares about trade. Okay, so we're going to start with a question. And the question is free trade or protectionism the way for the future? That's a poll question. You join at wef.ch/vote, and you get to vote either free trade or protectionism. And we should see the results come up as you vote. And again, people on the live stream can vote as well. Just go to that website. A lot rests on your decision. Okay, protectionism is off to a strong start. Wow. Okay, while it adjusts itself, it looks like protectionism is clearly ahead. Right now it's 64, well, 58-42. Okay, it's moving. I can't give you a clear answer, but I think protectionism is winning. I just thought very quickly we'd go through the panel and just get a view. Do you think that as we look forward, we're going to be moving into an age that's kind of more of a free trade age or more of a protectionist age? And we'll start with Dr. Marquez.
I think, well, thanks for being here. And I think the question, the answer should be in the middle. I don't think we'll see more free trade, more protectionism. We'll see something in the middle, depending on the region, on the country, and on the domestic conditions of countries. So we might see countries that are already very open, and it would be very difficult to go to a protectionist wave. And this is the case of Mexico, in which it's a very open economy. It's a global participant, and it would be very difficult. But countries that are already closed, maybe for them it would be more difficult to go in a road of more free trade.
Okay. So Azevedo, I think your staff was voting for free trade, so it might have skewed the results. But we seem to have settled at roughly 63 protectionist and 38 free trade. So, I mean, where do you see things heading? It's been a tough time for the WTO.
Well, the question is what people think it will be, not what they would like it to be. I mean, if I were, voting on what it should be, I would say free trade for sure. But what it will actually be, I think it's a more complex question, because we live in an age of disruptions at the political level for sure, at the domestic level mostly. You see structural changes in the labor market with new technologies. You see people being displaced by new products coming on. The level of unemployment is sometimes stable, but it's shifting from area to area, so it's below the radar somehow, but it's very much present. Now, those things are the things that drive policies. So people are not taking decisions on the basis of what is the best option for the country economically. The decisions are being taken on what is that my voters want.
Yeah.
And an easy answer in an age of disruption is to blame the foreign, is to blame something that comes from outside. Yeah. Imports is an easy target, so why not?
Okay. So we'll come back to this kind of a lightning round. Keu, what's your view?
We have seen in history waves of protectionism and free trade depending on the political situation, depending on domestic politics. I think it's very hard to get back to the height of free trade that we've seen in the last decade, but it will have a return.
Okay. Go ahead, Chad.
I'm generally an optimist by nature, but on this question, I'm very, very worried. Worried about protectionism in that sense. I think one of the bulwarks pushing back against the protectionism that might have otherwise been worse in the last 2 or 3 years are institutions like the WTO, and even NAFTA. Right, the concern that these things might get taken away, I think is partly what triggered Congress to vote overwhelmingly for TMAC. But we'll see. This has been 3 years in the United States already of this, and these institutions may not be able to push back forever. And so I am very worried that things could get worse.
Okay. We're going to do one more poll right now and then try to get into a slightly deeper conversation. The poll question, and then we'll discuss it, is will the WTO survive as a dispute resolution body? As you know, the appellate body is now not working. I think there's one member technically left out of the 7 because the Trump administration hasn't allowed anybody to be appointed. So the question is, will the WTO survive as a dispute resolution body? Okay. Okay, while it looks like there's strong, at least in this room, strong belief in the WTO, although there are some negatives kind of coming up. As we finish that up, I want to start with, whoops, getting really close now. Okay. This is going to be the 2020 U.S. election. Oh, there we go. Not saying which way. So let's start with the Director General. Just to quote, so the EU Trade Commissioner, Phil Hogan, has told the EU Parliament, if there isn't an enforcement mechanism, well then there isn't any point in having agreements. Is that true? I mean, and is there a path towards having an effective dispute mechanism?
Well, yeah, first of all, answering that question, that's one that I am 100% sure it will survive. I have no doubts about that whatsoever. But it will change. That's also the point. So it will survive, but it may not be the same that we have now. I think the dispute settlement mechanism is 25 years old. it was a huge improvement and change on what we had before, because before it was not automatic, was not mandatory. Now it is. It has teeth. It ends up in economic sanctions, and those things are tough. So it's not surprising that 25 years later, we are seeing people who are unhappy with the way that it developed. And now what they say is, okay, we're okay with it, but we have to change. It has to be reconstructed somehow. And I think that's the conversation that we're having now at the WTO. So making a long conversation very short, yes, I have no doubts it will survive. And we're talking about the long term as well. How quickly we can fix is the question. But I'm pretty sure we're going to fix it. It's just going to look different.
So, Keiyu, one of the criticisms of the appellate body from the United States was it was viewed as anti-Chinese, as pro-Chinese and anti-American. So the U.S. were criticizing it for not calling China on unfair trade practices, on industrial policy, on state support for SOEs. Anybody can answer that question, but I'm starting with you. Was that a fair critique?
No, I don't think so.
I'll let you.
You moved on.
Well, you know, you can go ahead and give you, but I was going to ask from more of a Chinese perspective. But
Let's hear the Chinese perspective.
I think two things were not in the perspective within the WTO system. One is emerging markets can graduate from their emerging market class, and they can become huge. And that's what happened to China. So when the terms were agreed at the time of, at the stage of China's development then, it all seemed like it was reasonable. But China graduated, and China became really large. So the new system has to take into account the possibility of emerging markets graduating and also including them more comprehensively in the rules.
any other thoughts on the?
I can take a crack at this
Sure,
one,
yeah.
because I spent far too much time thinking about
Yeah.
dispute settlement. So I think there are legitimate concerns with dispute settlement and its effectiveness in managing the relationship with China, and China's evolution not fully towards a market-oriented economy, and the conflicts that poses with the traditionally more market-oriented economies. That being said, the United States won most every dispute that it brought against China, and China complied with most every dispute that it brought against China. And so it's not as if the WTO dispute settlement system was fully exhausted when it came to dealing with conflicts with China. I think perhaps a legitimate American complaint about the dispute settlement process was, aside from the Americans, very, very few other countries were willing to use dispute settlement to address problems with China. Almost every dispute that other countries did bring, the United States was there as part of the leaders. No countries were willing to kind of go out there and use this on their own. And you hear from companies, they're worried about retaliation from China in certain respects, and that may have contributed to why they were hesitant. You don't see countries refusing to bring disputes against the United States. Anybody can bring a dispute against the United States, or Europe, right? And so I think there is this bit of concern that the system just might not be well tailored to deal with ways in which China is different.
And just if I could complement, the dispute settlement mechanism does not side with A or B. It implements the rules that exist. Now, one of the major questions that we have is whether the rules that exist now capture a lot of the practices that exist today out there, including China. Don't forget that when these rules were negotiated, China as it exists today didn't exist. The Chinese model didn't exist. This is new, and I think one of the things that members are trying to address is, have things changed to a point when we need to really update the rules? Yeah. China being a part of this conversation, of course. So it's not that the dispute settlement is favoring A or B or C. Yeah. The question is whether the rules that exist need to be updated somehow.
Yeah, but when people are now doing trade deals, they seem to be creating their own enforcement mechanisms that are kind of outside that process. I think TMEC does that. The U.S.-China trade deal does that. Is that a threat in a bad way to the kind of global system of trade regulation, or is it useful for the parties just to kind of come up with their own approaches? Do you?
I think no. I think positively on the idea of changing, of change within the WTO, and also incorporating specific rules in individual treaties. And that's because you're capturing a certain demand. You're trying to craft a long-term treaty that does not change with other external factors. So it's trying to take care of future disturbances. At the same time, changing at the WTO, the global framework, I think it's positive for the present, but most importantly, it's very important to take that change in a very positive manner so that we build a stronger WTO.
Okay. Let's turn to some of the deals that have been in the news and start with the U.S.-China trade deal. I mean, the simplest question is either party the winner? And how do we assess it from the broader standpoint of trade and the wider economy? I know, Kay, do you want to start with that?
Sure. The grand irony is that if China actually did everything that the U.S. demanded it to do, the result is going to be a much more successful Chinese economy, a much larger trade deficit in the U.S. Because the trade imbalance is the result of China's success, not because of other unfair practices which exist, but they're not the main driver. So when we think about the phase one deal, it's kind of the easier part of this. You can have Chinese people buy more American goods, and somehow the Chinese consumers will have to absorb the $2.4 billion of American nuts and say goodbye to their New Zealand and Australian suppliers, and we'll see how that, and have to buy more cars, et cetera. But that's the easy part. I think even getting to the IP issues, a lot of it is in China's interest anyways, what the US demands. IP protection is very important for a country that wants to step into the new phase of growth based on innovation. A lot of it's going to be about technical details about enforcement. But I think that an opening up financial services is going to bring more competition in China. China has always relied on, or not always, but very frequently relied on external pressure to change some of the very difficult things that needs political muscle. So in some sense, the trade deal is accelerating that. But I think that the difficult part is really much about the model that China has, the political economy model that uses strong state capacity, that has state-owned enterprises being a very central part of the economic objective, and the question about technology. So they have left those really important and very difficult things for the future, and what they have agreed upon is actually what China was willing to submit to in the first place.
And Chad, you've written that, excuse me, the failure of the deal to address state subsidies to state-owned enterprises is, quote, a giant hole in the phase one deal. You want to talk a bit about that?
So I think while this deal is great in the sense that it's calmed things, additional tariffs aren't going on, aside from that, the deal is essentially a disaster. It doesn't address any of the systemic issues that the GG talked about. There's a need for new rules out there, whether it's on subsidies that different countries use, whether it's on differential treatment of intellectual property and foreign investment. Those things have to be dealt with, and there's very little of that that's contained in this agreement. I'm very worried about what's actually in this agreement, which is about the stuff on purchases. And so I have a new piece out this morning. I spent the long weekend in the United States looking at the data on these $200 billion, or as the president said this morning, could be $300 billion worth of American sales to China. And these are unrealistic numbers, which kind of puts the whole viability of the deal into question, even the parts that are beneficial. But if these things were to ever happen, or you were to get close to them, the only way they could possibly happen would be from diverting trade away from other countries. Soybeans away from Brazil, fish away from Canada. And so to the question of what's the problem with using dispute settlement between two countries as opposed to the WTO, the WTO prevents that kind of outcome from happening. Its rules on non-discrimination are designed to protect all the other countries out there from these kinds of occurrences from taking place. So that's what I'm really concerned about with this deal.
Okay, and also if we can just address the IP issues, because, I mean, the president said today that, they were addressed. I mean, does the panel feel as if they were addressed effectively?
I can say
keep going.
I can say two words just on that. I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on a podcast, and that's what this thing is, if you haven't heard. So talking with lawyers that are really knowledgeable about the terms of the IP text, the intellectual property rights text of the agreement, there are some elements in there of China agreeing to take on commitments that they've never done before, to protect foreign trademarks and copyrights, to change their domestic legal system that would give rights to those types of IP holders that weren't there in the past. Now, the big question, though, is whether China will actually follow through with those commitments, and if what's ultimately backing it up is a promise to buy $200 billion of something that they're never going to be able to live up to, and if they don't, the Americans throw the deal away, then there really, really is a big question about, ultimately, at the end of the day, whether it is going to be enforceable or not.
Yeah. Does the $200 billion actually have to happen, or we only have to say it's going to happen?
In trade, I don't know. It used to be that things really had to happen, but I think we live in a new normal.
Right. Any other comments on the China trade deal? In terms of, is it a step in the right direction, or is it a political sop that gets us, through to the next election?
I think it's an intermediate step in terms of let's make it calmer, let's calm the environment, and then try to get a clearer idea of what is going to really happen. Mm-hmm. This is not what's going to happen, but it's just an intermediate step.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think we needed some kind of something new out there, because the escalation process was just going up and up and up and up, and we already had other tariffs announced already.
Yeah.
At the moment when you had all of those tariffs all the way up, I don't think the escalation would stop. It would just, spill into other areas of the relationship. So I think it's the political impact of this cannot be underestimated. However, there will be challenges. I think Chad made quite eloquently many of those points. And the fact that this was not about phase one. I mean, the beginning of the tensions was about essentially phase two, which is structural changes. Right. And that brings me to a very interesting point which Jen just made about whether if China complied, they would be much more competitive, much more able to, I think, export even more and be even more disruptive. People say that the WTO, China joining the WTO, made China grow. And they think it's because the WTO favors China. But the reality is that to join the WTO, China had to make several structural changes and reforms and lower the tariffs that they had across the board. So the opening up of the economy, which they didn't want to do, the opening up of the Chinese economy, the reforms that were put in place so that it would become or look much more like a market economy and so on and so forth, that gave a degree of dynamism to the Chinese economy that made, I would say, to a large extent, what they are today. So it's not like the WTO is favoring China. China had to reform. And I think that's the way forward anyway, but be careful what you wish for. That's all I would say.
Yeah.
So we'll do another poll, and then we'll get to the USMCA TMEC. The poll question is, does trade increase or decrease wealth disparities? And obviously wealth inequality is something that people have been talking about a lot here this week. Okay, so if those numbers hold, there still seems to be a strong view that trade decreases wealth disparities. Obviously, there's a very anti-trade critique that says otherwise, but that's not what we're seeing. So let's, with the thought of, to some degree, of income disparities in mind and the wages of Mexican workers in particular. Let's talk about the Mexico-U.S. Canada trade agreement. I mean, first of all, I'd just say, is it much different from NAFTA, and is it, by and large, better or worse? So let's start with Dr. Marquez.
Is it different? Well, it's a modernized, it's a NAFTA 2.0. It's the economy of the early 1990s is very different from the economy of 2020. So there were things in NAFTA that were very good for the three economies, and now there are things that didn't exist in 1994. So it was needed to include them. Small and medium enterprises was not in NAFTA, and I think regarding inequalities, and if we can think that small and medium enterprises in some sense were left out of NAFTA, so it's a better approach of trade integration, taking into account the need of taking care of small and medium enterprises. It's challenging, but the global economy in the third decade of the 21st century is challenging. Mm-hmm. So TMEC is challenging because of the global economy and because of the challenges that Mexico is facing. I'm not so surprised about the results of the poll, mm-hmm. but inequality has various dimensions, not only income inequality, but in terms, for instance, of region inequality. Mm-hmm. NAFTA did produce deepened regional inequality in Mexico. Mm-hmm. We are now trying with different instruments, not with the trade deal, but with different industries to close down those regional inequalities. So you cannot ask a trade deal what is not designed for. Mm-hmm. And NAFTA was not designed to close down the regional inequality. So we need to add other instruments as we're doing now.
Yeah. I mean, it was supposed to close the wage gap between Mexico and the U.S., and it was woefully insufficient at doing that. Do you think TMEC is going, with the labor protections in it, is going to do a better job of that?
I think it would be. I mean, it's very good perspectives on the labor issue, but also it's on the commitment of the political economy within Mexico. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We increased wages last year, nominal 16% without the TMEC, mm-hmm. and this year 20% without the TMEC. Yeah. In nominal terms, and 17% in real terms. So you need both. You need the internal political commitment and the trade deal. Yeah. So the combination of both, we do believe that it would be very good for workers.
So to widen the conversation on this deal a little bit, there's certainly an argument that when you say limit sourcing for automobile manufacture, to a particular region, that you ultimately raise costs to consumers. Is that one of the impacts? Anybody want to weigh in on that? Or any other views on TMEC?
So yes, I mean, ultimately, that will be, I think, one of the effects of this. But I wanted to pick up a little bit on something that was just said. I think that is fascinating. The new labor enforcement provisions in this agreement are unlike anything we have ever seen before. And if you're not in the weeds of trade agreements, this is worth looking at. So what they did with the amendments that were passed in the United States, and ultimately Canada and Mexico agreed to, back in December, is it provides for the enforcement of labor standards, collective bargaining, mm-hmm. The right to kind of unionize and bargain collectively at a given plant in Mexico to kind of be enforced by the United States, effectively, to say, hey, you're not allowing those workers at that plant to have their sufficient rights, so we're going to bring a trade dispute against you, and if that doesn't change, we're going to potentially be able to sanction that trade. That plant, whatever shoes that you sell that you wanted to export to the United States, we could put trade restrictions on something like that. It's a very new approach to trade agreements and to thinking about the role of labor standards in trade agreements in particular. To my knowledge, hasn't been tried anywhere yet, and I think we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. I don't think it will address the issues of income wealth disparities that just are kind of endemic out there in our changing, evolving economies. There's some relationship to trade there, but I would agree with you that those are very much the task of other domestic policies to deal with. Labor market adjustment policies, tax policies, not trade policies. But the new labor enforcement provisions in this agreement are just fascinating.
Go ahead.
Well, everybody else here has a PhD in economics, so I find myself at a disadvantage being just an engineer who's read about economics and has curiosity about it. But one thing that I would like to say is, I think the question itself is placing the burden on free trade. Inequalities in an economy are very indirectly linked to free trade. What I would say is free trade is usually associated with growth. Take a look around. I mean, the economies that are more open, that trade more freely, are the ones who tend to develop more and to grow more. Now, in my readings of an economist, maybe I misunderstood, but what I read mostly is that after long periods of prosperity, those inequalities tend to grow. Now, most of the reasons for that is not because of trade. So what is the answer? The answer is we don't grow to avoid inequalities? No, you want to grow. The problem is that governments are often MIA. They're missing in action. They're seeing the inequalities growing, and they're doing nothing about it. And then you reach points where this becomes a political problem. And you have all these disruptions with political upheavals and things like that. And then you dampen the growth and you go through depressions and whatever. And then, we're all fine now. No, you have no more inequalities at that level. No, that's not fine. I think what we need to do is be ready for that. I mean, inequalities are out there. We all know that they're there. Governments need to act and step in. And I think Graciela made the point.
I'll just jump in and say that different countries, domestic policymakers have done jobs better or worse in protecting those who lose out from trade. I mean, indeed, inequality across countries have been reduced because of growth in trade, but there are losers and winners at different skill levels, so we have to acknowledge that. And another problem is that it's often very concentrated in terms of locality. The US, for example, has gained a lot from trade, but because one geographical location is concentrated in one manufacturing industry, everybody loses the job, and they don't really recover. But the US government, policymakers could have done much more to protecting and giving these people better opportunities, and other countries have done it better. So I think it is a domestic political issue. Don't blame it on trade, but policymakers have to take action. And then we have the more greater challenge, which is technology displacing jobs is a much greater threat.
Yeah, and actually that's the last topic I want to hit. I do want to take audience questions, so if you can answer this very complicated question in a very short amount of time, it would be great, which is regulation of data flows. I mean, the flow of data across borders is obviously huge, contributes enormously to the economy, and there doesn't seem to be a coherent way of regulating it. There's lots of shots at it regionally and locally. What should we be doing? Should there be a global regime for regulating data flow, and kind of what would that look like in 3 minutes total?
I think we should be creative. This is a new phenomenon. This is a phenomenon of the 21st century. And we need really to design long-term regulation that did not hamper the growth of data. In Mexico, we would like to call it data industry.
Yeah.
So that it expands at a good pace, but at the same time, do not leave it without regulation. So we need to regulate, but in a gradual manner.
But globally, is this
globally,
the job
absolutely.
of the WTO? And if so, what are you doing about it?
Well, we are, in fact, working on that finally. And this is a very critical aspect of the conversation. We were talking about negotiations on electronic commerce, but in some areas, it's not only about e-commerce itself, it's much bigger than that. One of these chapters, one of these areas is free data flows. And I would say you have two extremes here. One is an extreme where all data has to flow freely. That's one concept. The other one is all data should be under the control of governments or regulatory agencies or whatever. I think those two extremes are what they are, extremes. The conversation at the end of the day in the WTO at this point in time is somewhere in the middle. So everybody agrees that to the extent possible, data should flow freely so as to allow businesses to do what they do, right? But at the same time, there are some key principles that need to be subject to control, like confidentiality or privacy. How do you ensure that? Now, there are different models out there in different governments on how they do it. Some first check whether the company complies before they allow for free movement of data. Others do it ex post. So they give the general principle, and only if they detect a problem, they will go and try to regulate that. And I think what we have is a need to have clarity about that so as to avoid a situation where data flows are unduly or unnecessarily restricted and therefore dampening economic growth and prosperity. But we're handling that at the WTO now, and I'm very happy that this conversation is happening.
Great. So I do want to open it up to questions unless anybody has a very quick comment. Okay. So questions from the audience, please do stand up, and if you don't mind stating your name and where you're from, and we do have microphones coming around.
So I'm a farmer from India, and I want to say that when President Trump said that he's going to walk out of WTO, Indian farmers were in support of him. And because we find that WTO has trade deals based on monetary terms have been very bad for developing country farmers. When you look at US subsidies at $16 billion for 2 million farmers, it comes to something like $8,000 per farmer. When you look at India, it's subsidies at like $250 per farmer. But when trade agreements look at it, you only look at it in monetary terms. So do you see the new learning that's coming in of how international trade has impacted livelihoods in poor countries? Do you think we will turn to a point where we will start looking at subsidies in terms of persons rather than only looking at in terms of monetary dollars? That's the question, I think. So whoever wants to answer, thank you.
Okay, I think, Mr. Azevedo, I think that's mainly aimed at you.
Yeah, I think I can't avoid that. No, and I wouldn't want to, because I think that's a very important point. Subsidies, at the end of the day, is about distortions, right? It's what degree of distortion they introduce in the market. And of course, countries in general tend to believe that what they do does not distort, which others would disagree. Now, this is at the end of the day a negotiation. The situation that we have today is that you have that argument that you just made being espoused by different sides. Some are saying, look, you are spending much more than I am in agriculture, therefore distorting markets much more than I am. The other side is responding and say, look, but on a per capita or per producer basis, I am much less distortive than you are. And look, I'm not going to take sides here. I think they have to come together and figure something out. Now, this is the kind of conversation that we have to have if we want the negotiations on agriculture to move forward. Because this is one of the key elements, is subsidies, support. How do you ensure that you are taking care of people who use the subsidies at a subsistence level and therefore not distorting the market very much? And those who are really, business-driven and commodity producing and things like that, that's a conversation that needs to happen in a more profound and detailed way in the WTO.
So let's take some more questions. Please try to keep the questions short so we can get a few in. Go ahead. Let's get a microphone over to you.
I'm sorry, Torsten Slok, Deutsche Bank. So there's generally a perception, and several of you mentioned also this, that the US, of course, is now doing a lot about trade. And the question that I get a lot from clients, which I would like to hear your answers to, is it correct to say that the US has been treated unfairly in global trade? What indicators would you look at to assess whether this is correct or not? In other words, when people discuss a lot of the initiatives that have been coming from the US administration, is it correct to say that this was an unfair way of dealing with things, or is it right to say that the US has been treated unfairly in global trade for many years?
Anybody can take that? Chad, why don't you?
Everybody's a sinner in global trade. Everybody breaks the rules. But I think some of the Americans' legitimate complaints are out there. And not so much complaints, but I get back to the Director General's point that we're just now in a world where there's different systems that we have to resolve. I think it's far too easy to say the United States is getting mistreated. It's just we need to come up with a new way of engaging with each other. The US and China in particular are two examples, but I think it goes bigger than that. Because the world is just fundamentally different than it was before. And so I think that's too easy a way to kind of get ourselves out of the actual conversation that we need to have to design new rules to fix these kinds of problems.
Any other comment on whether the U.S. is getting treated unfairly?
No, just very briefly, because I think, again, I feel that I should step in. They feel that they have. And as a political actor, which I am, and the WTO is, it's less about whether that claim or that concern is true, but more the fact that it exists. And then how do you handle that? I would say many of the points that they make are valid. They're quite valid. Others, maybe not. But I think what we need to do is sit down. The concerns exist. I think just now Japan, the US, and the EU came up with a paper that talks about a number of elements that they think in the WTO rules need to change to address many of those things that you mentioned that they claim to be unfair and allow distortions in the market. That's a very positive step to voice and express those concerns. And, well, that's a good start. And let's continue to have this conversation in a way that is not as disruptive and that ends up in retaliations and sanctions and tariffs. You know, I don't think that's the best way. Sometimes it's necessary, but that's not definitely the best way to handle this.
Let's take another question. Okay, we've got one over here. Just need to get you a mic.
Thank you. Goldie Hyder with the Business Council of Canada. A couple of trends, and just want you to comment on the impact of that. One is that trade deals seem to be getting shorter. USMCA, 6 years, we'll be back at it, not exactly stability. The other thing is in democracies, particularly, we're seeing polarization where in the past, trade deals, you might have run against it, but you don't actually come and take it out and change it fundamentally. There seems to be a trend now where you undo whatever it is the previous government has done. Will this have the impact of actually driving business to state capitalism environments, which offer more stability?
I don't think that having a 6-year term introduces uncertainty. It allows you to make the adjustments needed for the period, for the 6-year period. Otherwise, you have to wait 25 years and refurbish the entire treaty. So I tend to be more optimistic on having this 6-year break so that investors can voice their needs and might be included in the round of the 6-year period. There's an optimistic way of seeing things.
Any other comments?
A more pessimistic way of seeing things would be to look at what's happened in the UK, right, where it's been now 3 years and we've no progress with anything, and you know, it just seems like it's politics driving things. So I get worried that yes, if you have responsible policymakers that can make reforms necessary to update things, it works, but sometimes that's not who you're stuck with.
Okay. So we have time for one quick question and one quick answer over here, right by the camera.
Thanks, Faisal Islam, BBC. What do you think about the idea of the digital sales tax that France wants to impose being delayed until after the election?
Digital.
Has it been delayed till after?
Yeah, there was an agreement between the U.S. and France to hold off on that. I think it was today or yesterday. Yeah.
Has it been signed? Have we seen the signatures? Well, I mean, this is the legitimate question, right? We've heard many times before that there was a deal. So I think if If they have agreed that, I think that's probably good news. The OECD, in my view, needs more time to kind of get to yes and get to a multilateral solution on this. I'm very worried that if they don't, that the United States might go forward with the $2.4 billion of retaliatory tariffs against France, and that could escalate and make life difficult with the European Union as well. So if this actually happens, I think that would be a positive step.
Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time. We didn't even get to the...
May I compliment that?
Yes, please.
Just to say very quickly, how much time do I have? No,
None.
time out. So this issue will not go away,
Yeah.
just to be clear. So we have to figure out.
Okay. So we didn't even get to Brexit or EU, whether you could get a trade deal in a year, but that's for another day. Thanks to this wonderful panel, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.